Janet, let's talk a little bit about Catholic schools, and I wanted to address the question of the quality of work done there and what kind of a job the Catholic schools are doing. I think thesis would be that they are a success story, that they do good work, and since you're the superintendent of schools, you probably know a bit about that and would like superintendent of Catholic schools, I should say, and that you probably would like to talk a little bit about the good things that our schools do. I think there was probably a time in my own memory when that was very questioned. I can remember sitting around with my peers, people I went to school with who were then raising their children and deciding where they were going to send them to school. Deep discussions saying, I'm not sending them to Catholic schools, the classes are too large, I don't think they're doing a good job, I want them in the public schools. I remember that very clearly. And I think that what we found is that there is new research that probably begins to shed a different light on this whole question about what kind of a job Catholic schools do in general.
I guess I respond to that by saying I'm not sure that that was a true perception years ago. I mean, I've heard that often, too. There really wasn't any research to show, other than us, the products of those schools. But at least...
that never came into the discussions much, as I'm remembering it. But anyway, go ahead.
I think there are a lot of myths about Catholic schools. And I think oftentimes people who went through them years ago still have the same perception that the schools do have large classes, that they are repressive. You still have the sisters with the rulers. And I think they don't visit or look at Catholic schools today to see that we've evolved, as have public schools. I mean, we now have obviously much smaller classes and are up on technology, up in the different courses of study. And we have 20 years of research from people like James Coleman, who is not a Catholic researcher at all, from Andrew Greeley, from Valerie Lee, people who have looked at it and said, let's find out how those schools really are doing.
Well, let's take a look at some of that research. You mentioned James S. Coleman, who has done some research. He tells the story himself that he headed a University of Chicago group of 5 researchers, and he was asked by the U.S. Department of Education to look into questions of high school education, effectiveness, and so on. And he really came at it. He's not a Catholic. He comes at it from a scholarly kind of viewpoint, and I think he ended up being tremendously surprised at what he learned. They actually studied over 58,000 high school students across the nation, and they dealt with sophomores and then with seniors to see what kind of progress these students made within this period of time. Incidentally, he's written a couple of books that detail the kind of research he did. One is called Achievement, Public Catholic and A&D Private Schools Compared. And then he wrote another one that came out in 1987, Public and Private High Schools, The Impact of Communities, which is sort of a revealing title. But James S. Coleman fundamentally found out that Catholic schools do a good job, that they do a better job than public schools do. Now, I don't think the whole thing here is to make that comparison so much, but, I mean, you have to have some benchmark against which you're looking to see if you're doing a good job or not. Not meant to put down public schools, but Coleman's studies were surprising. In fact, he said that when they first came out with this material, people got angry, and they thought that they were heretics. And the real reason, of course, was because the public schools in the United States had become like the churches. They were like holy places, and to tear down the public schools or to say there was somebody doing a better job really was not acceptable to many people. It was material came out in 1982, and as Coleman himself said, it's like attacking motherhood or attacking the sacred shrine to say that the Catholic schools were doing a better job than were the public schools. And he said people saw him as a heretic. And, of course, he could understand that because he himself is not a Catholic. But anyway, we might look at some of the results of those studies, the things he found out.
I think one more thing before we do that is people looked at it and said, well, there were so many factors as to why those students would succeed that, that's the reason. It isn't because there's really better education going on. Factors like socioeconomic or not having to take, choosing the students you want and financial commitment on the part of parents. But when he did his research, he factored out those different areas and tried to actually compare how the students were doing with students in public schools, and still found that there was a success story to be told in the Catholic schools in the major subject areas, that students just achieved better in areas such as mathematics or reading or language arts.
Right, and then he found out that the Catholic schools did not do significantly better in civics and science. And part of his sense there was that at times they did not have the same resources in terms of science that might have been had, the equipment and so on that would be had in the public system. But he said they didn't do more poorly. They actually did about the same in those areas of civics and science. Remember, we're dealing with a very large sampling that he did, 58,000 students, this research done in the early 80s. And then, yeah, as you said, he tried to factor out all of that and ends up still thinking that these Catholic schools are doing a very good job. And that raised the question, well, why is this happening, right?
That's right.
And he did learn a lot of things, it seems to me. But why don't you tell us a little bit about
Well,
that?
one of the things that he discovered, one of the reasons for the success in Catholic schools is what he calls social capital, that the schools function within a specific community, a specific, really, value system, where it's not just the teachers who are promoting this, but the larger community. The parents buy into it, the parish community, if it's centered in a parish, buys into it. It's really kind of the old-time neighborhood school, where if the youngster messed around outside of school, somebody was there to put him back in line. We all pretty much bought into the same behaviors and motivations and community, so that student felt that kind of support and motivation.
That's one of the major factors. What do you call it? Social capital?
He calls it social capital.
Yeah, and I think there was some place where he said that the Catholic schools of the 80s, and he was doing his research, ended up being like the public schools of the 50s, where they still often had a neighborhood network, where there was more of a sense of community, not as much fragmentation, and support for what was going on there. And I think part of his sense is that has broken down in the culture as a whole, and that this hurts education because we've lost that sharp cultural cohesion, I suppose, that one would be looking for, and that somehow that's been maintained, at least to some degree, within the Catholic community. Could we also, I mean, if we don't use his terms, the social capital, it's you could talk about a sense of community still being there. So if the kid comes to the Catholic grade school, and this is a parish school, and they meet people there that they know, and the parents know one another. I think one of his examples again was that it's what he means by that whole concept is like if your kid tells you that he wants to stay out till midnight, and all of his friends say that they can do that, their parents let him out, and you don't know any of his parents of these other students, and you have no way of checking that. But if they happen to be friends of yours and you interact with them regularly, you know whether they let the kid to stay out till midnight or not.
I think some of it too is you can pretty much guess what the limits will be that the other parents will set, because we're pretty much buying into the same kind of a system, that the students understand this is, where they fit, and I think it's more of a mission. I think our schools have a very particular mission, and parents, when they choose to come to our schools, buy into that. The parish community supports it, and the teachers understand it. And so really that student is not just left to one teacher and, to go wherever that's going to go, but fits into the whole program.
It's part of the integrated notion of Catholic philosophy of education, I think. And when you look at that and you sort of hope that all the components see the vision and have a fundamental sense of values and what the faith is all about, that it gives a sense of integration and perhaps is part of the reason for the success. He does point out, however, a number of other things that I thought were important. That he himself sort of comes down on the side that Catholic school students take more courses in difficult subjects like advanced English or solid geometry, trigonometry, algebra, and so on, than do students with comparable backgrounds at public schools or even at other private schools. So that he thinks that one of the reasons it works, or that we're doing a better job, is because of the curriculum itself.
I'd like to say that was a conscious decision over the years to not offer a lot of various courses. I happen to think it's a result of financial constraints, that we never had the resources to offer a lot of the different things that parents maybe hoped we could, or that we felt we should. And it proved to be a good decision. Maybe it was consciously made by somebody, but as I look at it, I think, we said, well, we can't offer all of that, so we're going to continue to offer the strong courses that we feel they have to have. And so a student that comes into our school doesn't really get to choose through a lot of things. You're going to take, a lot of math, you're going to take science, you're going to take language arts, because that's what we offer.
That's an interesting analysis. I don't know how much you're going to be able to back that up, but that's interesting that maybe we fell into it. In the Catholic Church, I think that has happened for us on other occasions where we've done something good and sort of by accident perhaps, but there's clearly that's his reading of the data from all of these many students and so on, is that the curriculum itself is more focused and there's more difficult courses and there's less variety and so on, and that seems to produce something good. I must say that does it not seem as though the educational world as a whole is recognizing that these days, saying put more time into reading and learning how to write and so on. I mean, that's generally understood today that we're going to have to improve on that, and that's one of the directions we ought to go in.
And I think homework. I think if you look at the amount of homework that the youngsters in our schools do, that certainly is another reason that they show some success, because there are a lot of demands made on that homework area.
One of the things that Coleman says as well is that the parents backing up the authority of the teachers in the school is a big part of this. Now, I was thinking in Japan, one of the theories of why the education works there so well is because of the mothers. The mothers play an absolutely crucial role, and what they do is they make sure the students do their work. They force them to do it, and they always back up the teachers in the school. There's none of this business of running in there and saying, well, you're treating my kid unfairly and so on. They don't look at it that way. So they're always reinforcing what the school says. And it seems to me at least some of that might be found within the Catholic system here, where there's a predisposition to think that somehow what they're doing there is right, or the people there are good. Now, I know that breaks down, and you can find Catholic people who are going to say, hey, I'm not that naive, and so on. But there might be some more of it there in the Catholic system than we find within the public school system.
I think there is. And I think overall there's more parental involvement. And part of the reason is because that parent is putting down tuition and saying, I'm spending my money, I expect you to do a good job, and I'm going to watch to make sure that you do. We do have a lot of parental support and a lot of parental involvement, but we also give the parents a lot of opportunity for getting involved. Each school has a local school council, which is made up of parents who send their children there, who are advisory to the principal and to the pastor, and who know what's going on and can be part of, seeing the development of that school.
How is that working, do you think?
I think it works very well. I think it's an excellent program. I think it allows the school the local autonomy that it needs. It still functions within the church and within the hierarchy of the church. The pastor still basically oversees the school, but you have a group of parents who are right there worried about that particular school, looking at the policies set for that school and offering their best advice on what would be to the betterment of the school.
It's in our American tradition, isn't it, in many ways? And maybe, again, the public school system might learn something from that. In fact, isn't there a general perception in the educational world today that parental involvement is important and that we must get them more concerned about the schools, and if they do, that the students will function better and so on?
Sure. right now I think the public schools talk about it as site-based management, where locally the school has the opportunity to make decisions for themselves and for the good of the school, and to allow the parents to be part of that. I think we've just always evolved that way, and it has proven to be very beneficial.
One of the other things that Coleman brings up in his studies is the question of discipline. He found that there definitely was more discipline in the Catholic schools than in the public schools, but he ended up thinking that that was not really the decisive factor in them doing a better job. But he did find greater discipline there, and of course that's a very appealing thing to people today. I think that so many parents today, their dominant concern is of drugs and the kids being out of control and all of that. And I think that there's a growing feeling that the Catholic schools do a good job of this. Of course, there's exceptions to it, and we got our own failures, that's for sure, and our own individual teachers who haven't always acted properly and so on. We've got our scandals and terrible things. We hate to see it in the papers and all of that. But so, I mean, not painting too rosy a picture here of this discipline that we've got in our schools, but he found that it was better than in the public school system.
I think a lot of parents look to our schools because of the discipline, and I think there are a lot of reasons. Historically, we have always worked hard, I think, at maintaining a sense of order and a sense of community. And I think it goes back to our whole philosophy. The students understand that we have a value system, and we expect them to be part of that and to buy into that. We also get a lot of parent support, which helps your discipline a lot when the parents are, as you said earlier, home saying, yeah, I expect you to respect the teachers and to learn and to do what you're supposed to do. I think we simply work at trying to offer not an oppressive environment, but a respectful Christian climate in the school.
And using that word, not oppressive, might take us back to older days where it was often experienced that way, and where you'll talk to a lot of older Catholics who love to tell those stories about the terrible discipline that went on in those
nuns.
Catholic school. Right, the nuns often take a rap. I don't hear the priest so much.
No.
I mean, priests usually, it's like I got yelled at in confession. That might be where it happens with the priest, but it was always the nuns who took people and threw them up against the blackboard and bloodied their hands and all of this. I somehow have this vision of this one nun who went around throwing kids against blackboards, very strong woman and so on. But anyway, you do hear the stories, and your carefully chosen words there, I take it, were to say what we want to be disciplined, but not in any kind of repressive way.
That's right. Yeah, I think we have to be honest, too, to say that people come to our school by choice. And, we certainly don't, I would say, for the most part, pick and choose the people who come. There's hardly any selection at all in elementary schools, and I think not a whole lot in the high schools. But we do have the ability to say to a student, if this is not for you, then you need to find a different school. And while we certainly don't try to use that to any extent, it is one of the reasons.
But the truth is you can get rid of big troublemakers in a way that the public school system cannot.
That's correct.
I
think you have to look at that and say that's
factored into this question of discipline for sure.
Sure.
And the public school people often say that. I mean, of course you got better discipline because the 5 people in the class that are so disruptive, you can get rid of them if you want. And they cannot continue to cause problems. But the fact of the matter is that Coleman found that the Catholic schools were more disciplined, but he thought that it wasn't the thing, because when he studied some Catholic schools where the discipline wasn't all that great, he still found that their success was better. And their success, and I don't know, did we detail enough that success, Janet? I mean, higher scores in math and science and language arts and so on, that's for sure. But isn't it also part of the success in sending people on to college and dropout rates improved and things like that?
Much less dropout rate. No. I mean, I think our dropout rate is maybe a fourth what the general dropout rate is for.
1/4, you think? Yeah.
I think maybe we have 3 or 4% dropout rate.
I've seen that figure, something around there. Yeah.
Where usually I think it's about 12 or 15% or even higher, depending on the school district.
We also have a higher percentage of people going to college, but
That's
of course
right.
everyone can say that's a selective process. I mean, it's, it doesn't mean anything in one sense. I think that's what the public school people would say if they're thinking that somehow this is a threat to them, this Coleman work that's done here.
But I think when the youngster comes in, a lot of Coleman's work was done in high school. When the youngster comes into the high school, we gear them towards some kind of ongoing education. I mean, it may not be a full 4-year college, but the expectation is you're going to continue. You're not going to just end up after 12th grade.
And that makes a difference.
And it makes a difference.
And it's true, even if they don't go to college, they're supposed to be lifelong learners,
That's right.
I mean, we're all supposed to be willing to keep learning and reading and studying and continuing along the path that way. Is there anything else about the Coleman material that we wanted? Because I wanted to get in a little bit of time for Andrew Greeley too, and you've got other researchers, I think, that one of Greeley's big things is always that we sell ourselves short. He's so many of his articles are just blasting Catholic leadership, because for selling the Catholic schools short and not taking this research seriously. And his own research shows fundamentally the same thing, that Catholic schools are good, that they help promote community, that Catholics who go to Catholic school develop better outlooks on the church and learn how to relate better, are more involved in social justice projects, etc. And I think what I get out of his articles are usually like, hey, why don't we listen to the research? Why are we so defensive and so on when we got a good story to tell?
Well, I think Greeley, unlike Coleman, is really a Catholic researcher. And he looks at the church and the benefit to the church and the benefit to the faith, not so much on the academics. I think Coleman said we are doing the job academically. We are having successes there. Greeley is saying if you want to have a strong church, if you want a church member who's there for the church in the future, then the longer they're in Catholic schools, the more chance there will be that person will be supportive and a good adult member of the faith.
And then he says, let's put our money there, and let's make sure that we don't close down schools, keep them open, build new ones, and don't lose your nerve. That's it, the message
That's
I
right.
get out. Don't lose your nerve, stick with this whole
Well,
project.
we found something that's working. Why would we, not stay with it?
Right.
Why would we put our money somewhere
And he
else?
puts a lot of emphasis on Coleman's research as well. He often quotes it. Yeah. Janet, anybody else who you want to mention that tells us things about the successes of the Catholic schools?
There's another researcher from Search Institute out of Minneapolis, Peter Benson. And the Search Institute basically tries to look at not just education, but a lot of different aspects, especially in the development of adolescents, to see what are factors that provide success for these adolescents. He is not himself a Catholic, he's a Lutheran, and he did a study on trends. He compared Catholic youngsters in Catholic high schools as compared to Catholic youngsters in public high schools, more in the area of character development and values than in the area of academics, although he has done some in academics. But he did a 10-year study between 1976 and 1986 on different values to see what ones were increased and what ones were decreased, and then what were some of the factors that caused that to show. It showed many successes. It showed some successes for Catholics in Catholic schools, and what he did is he took something like being pro-marriage, whether these students had an attitude of being pro-marriage or not, and whether that attitude increased in those 10 years from them being in a Catholic school or not, or if there wasn't any change. The areas where our students showed an increase were things like racial tolerance, equality of women, pro-marriage, less militaristic or more pro-peace, better self-esteem, more church attendance. Those were areas where we increased. In other areas, for example, concern for others or contributing money to the church, those kinds of things, there was no change. His belief was those 10 years were very years of upheaval, and if we could at least maintain the attitude and not decrease it, that was still a positive factor. The only area where we showed difficulty was in the area of drug abuse. And I think we're all of us who work in education are aware that that is an area that we have to deal with.
And Catholic schools weren't doing any better.
No, Catholic schools students were
we
not.
doing worse?
We increased the use of drugs over those 10 years, Catholics and Catholic high schools, rather than decreased or no change.
But the other values that you pointed out would really be important ones, wouldn't they, in terms of tolerance of other people and involvement in justice and so on. That would be really good things to be able to point to say that our schools do. I think I saw one place where it was described that he was just dealing more with the matters of the heart and not the intellect, and that he was seeing that we really were doing well on the character questions and so on.
Well, it said to me, if we weren't doing well, then we really do need to question our schools. Because this, we claim this is our difference, that we develop those attitudes in our students.
Jan, we only have a few seconds. Anything else you want to add that you didn't get in there? Because you literally only have a couple seconds.
Just overall, the successes in character and in academics that our schools show.
Well, we've been talking about Catholic schools and trying to deal with the quality and the success story that you like to tell and that the research backs up. James Coleman's important studies, Andrew Greeley's, various studies that suggest that Catholic schools do a good job. They do a good job academically, and they do a good job in terms of helping people to improve their personalities, characters, and their effectiveness in the world. And that today, I would say, would be a lot to be proud of.